And now that you've learned a little bit more about the three of us and our work in the COVID and SSI space, so we're ready to start an open conversation around using the verifiable credentials to open a society and economy. And to avoid any confusion, I think you guys know what we mean by SSI, self-sovereign identity. So if you hear us using VC, we're VCs in our conversation, we mean verifiable credentials, not venture capitalists. So speaking of SSI and VC, so I would like to start a conversation by inviting Riley to quickly walk us through how the technology evolved to what is today. Because Riley, you have been been following the space from its infancy, and share your take on why it is ready for wider adoption.
Yeah. So when I got involved at Sovereign Foundation, the technology, there was technology that existed. In fact, the Sovereign Network, which is the underlying blockchain that powers the sort of SSI use case, was already launched and it was already running. So that was good. But there were two things that were really missing. The first is good technology and open source standards for the layer above the blockchain. So, there's a blockchain and you can anchor public keys and schemas and other things on it to facilitate verifiable credentials, but you also need a wallet to hold those verifiable credentials in. And when I got involved at Sovereign, there weren't open source wallets or really any standards to help different wallet providers be interoperable with each other. And now we are, I wouldn't say we're all the way there. It'll probably be an ongoing effort for years, but there's at least a suite of interoperability tests and protocols in the Hyperledger Aries project and with the DIDCOM protocol that enable cross-platform and cross-vendor interoperability. And we've done several of those demos. We just did one with the government of British Columbia a few weeks ago. And so the first thing that really made the technology really ready for prime time is these sort of layer 2 wallet standards and interoperability protocols. The second thing that really made, I think, the technology much more ready for real life usage is all of the work that has been done on policy and legal. I just want to reiterate what Peter said about, the technology is just like, a small fraction of what's required to really get a solution to market. The technology, in our view, is production ready, but there's still a lot of work to be done on the legal side and the policy side. But one of the things that's really been valuable is all of the work that was done at the Sovereign Foundation and funded in part by the community on GDPR thought leadership, and it actually led to deep dives into law. Led to changes in the way that the Sovereign Network was architected, and it ultimately led to sort of all user DIDs being off ledger. And there's a bunch of technical details we could talk about, but the reality is, practically speaking, what matters is that there's been enough thinking done about how these frameworks fit into global legal regulations that I think without that, it really wouldn't be ready for prime time. You're muted, Lucy.
We have a question here that's kind of relevant to what you're talking about. So how can VC be ready for wider adoption when there's only a few wallets, or when no wallets have been audited for security and privacy? What's your take on this, Riley?
So our wallets have been audited for security and privacy internally, right? I mean, we haven't. This brings up a good point, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if we had external auditors and auditor accreditors and governance bodies that accredit the auditor accreditors, and so a really robust ecosystem of trust, right? I think just we're early, so we're not going to be there, right? There's no business model for an accreditor when, like you said, there's only a few wallets. But yeah, we've done, we had external audits done on our security on both the open source wallet code as well as the street cred wallet, and so that's a comment on that part. The other part is there are only a few wallets, but that doesn't mean that they can't be used in prime time. The standards and the open source the open source standards for for developing wallets are there. The building blocks are there, and there are open source reference code bases that you can go and, you know, build your own wallet today if you wanted to. So, you know, I don't think there's perfect answers to those questions because we're still early, but I think we're ready enough that we don't need to keep stalling. We can go ahead and move some things into production.
Thank you, Riley. Just to add a little bit of context here, the open source code Riley was talking about, they kind of both were donated to the community, are one of the main kind of resources for the entire community to build on wallet on. So they're kind of at least gave us a little bit comfort because that code is not just managed by one company, like a private company. It's kind of open to the entire community to criticize or audit. So that's a little bit context here. Peter, can you share a little bit more, like what's your thought process at TNO when you started the Unlock project in terms of like evaluating the readiness of the technology?
Yeah, I can sort of. Based on what Riley said, in our consortium we have one law firm and one bank, so we are following also quite a rigorous approach to having all the regulatory checks done on our expo. So the regulatory compliance is involved in the process, but it's also one of the first times in the Netherlands that we're actually doing this. And so I agree with Riley that technology-wise it works. But there is not yet sufficient paperwork filled out to prove that it works also to non-technical people, right? And so I think I see this actually as a boost. This is for us the first time that we're working together with all these companies to combine all this brain power from both the legal side, the compliance side, and it will at least give us a very strong framework. What I think we're also learning is that you're not auditing just the technical component or the wallet, you're auditing the whole system. So also how you connect to certain health data, how you deal with this health data. There's a lot of rules and regulations around it that have nothing to do with SSI, but you need to follow them. And I think we're now at this point learning more and more that this is quite complex. At least in the Netherlands it's quite complex, but I don't think it will be much different overseas. So I think the maturity is more that the people you're also talking to don't know what SSI is. So sometimes they need to reorient the way they're thinking, how they would typically do such a legal audit. It changes when you're talking decentralized, and it doesn't even matter if it's SSI or blockchain or multi-party computation or other decentralized technologies. It just requires a different mindset, especially from legal people, is my feeling. So I'm happy we found a law firm that is quite into technology and is actively, I think CMS is great in this aspect that they have this sort of tech-focused practice. So that's also something I recommend, is to get such lawyers into the community that are that understand technology and that are willing to help. Yeah, and I think also the standards that Riley is referring to, we're using the same. We're also using Aries, Indy, DITCOM standards. So I think the whole world is sort of converging towards these technologies. And are they production ready? Yes, for certain use cases they are, and I think you can easily build a point solution now. It's still hard to build the fully interoperable solution if you're talking COVID. If you want to build a system where people can fly from all over the world and use their local health data in any other place in the world, technically you might be able to pull it off, but there's still some difficulties in the policies and how you change them, and how do you I think one of the things that is for us quite interesting is what they're now calling a local assurance communities. So how do you know who to trust? In the Netherlands, we know which laboratory is a real laboratory, but we don't know this from a country across the globe. And it's very hard to determine who should you then trust to point out which are the legit laboratories and which are non-legit. And how does this work in countries that have a malfunctioning legal system and have a lot of corruption and bribery, right? So those are also things that are being developed in the standards community, but they're not fully. You cannot just pick them off the shelf. You need to really think about this. So I'm seeing sort of the global use cases, especially about travel, I think are still quite complicated.
Thank you both. Because as we're talking about, there are like a bunch of like non-technical people, or like people not from the SSI space, probably who don't understand the tech enough. So I prepare a very simple kind of graph to show. Because if some of you like have been following the SSI space, probably you've heard of trust over IP stack, but that's like a very simplified version I'm showing here. Is for if you're talking about the full stack, we're talking about stack for technology and stack for governance. And the governance, like that's something we've been discussing, even like the global initiative that all the three of us are part of. We're not only talking about the governance, there are different sides, how the technology should work, and also on the human side, how human organizations should interact with each other. So we're actively discussing these issues, and even though some of the problems or issues still need to be resolved. Just to give, like, for those of you who are new to technology or SSI specifically, I want to provide here a very high level and simplified idea of what we mean by ready. So at least, so there are 4 layers that form the SSI technology stack. So I believe most, like the 3 of our companies are mainly working at the layer 3 and layer 4. And I think Riley's company, they're contributing like a lot to the layer 1, layer 2 as well. So for Northern Block, we are at 90% like a layer 4. So like it took some time for layer 1 and layer 2 to take shape and for things to standardize as those 2 layers. That's what Riley was talking about. And some of you may know that verifiable credentials have officially become a W3C standard last year. So while standardization of DIT, decentralized identifier, is still like mission almost accomplished. And thanks to maturity and standardization at the foundational layers, so companies such as 3Grad are able to create platform and tooling at layer 3 for companies like Northern Block to build, or TNO to build business applications at layer 4. So our work at top layers are important for the further development and standardization at bottom layers, while we're also counting on the bottom layers to keep evolving to improve stability, usability, security, and unlock new functionalities. So that's the reason why, I mean, when we're talking about a wider adoption, it's not about, okay, it's everything is ready. It's like what the work we're doing at adoption level will help the fundamental layers of technology to keep evolving. And I hope this is helpful for those of you who are not technical.